Welcome to True Echo, where real strength, dignity, and justice echo louder than hate. In today's story, a humble janitor gets mocked by a black belt fighter in front of a crowd. But when he finally steps onto the mat, the entire gym witnesses a transformation no one saw coming. This is a story about buried legends, painful pasts, and the true meaning of respect. What happened next will leave you speechless. "Hey janitor, what do you say to a little spar?" The words echoed across the glossy white floor of elite martial arts, bouncing off the mirrors and hanging heavy in the fluorescent-lit silence. Daniel Mitchell, a proud black belt in his mid-30s, stood with his arms crossed, a cocky grin stretching across his face. His belt gleamed under the lights, almost as bright as the arrogance in his voice. Around him, a dozen students from the advanced evening class paused their stretches and warm-downs, their attention now fixed on the man he was addressing, Brandon Lewis. He stood near the edge of the room, mop in hand, pushing water in long, even strokes across the mat. At 42, he had the lean, muscular frame of someone who worked hard but stayed quiet. His janitor's uniform, a dark blue jacket, sleeves rolled neatly to the elbows, hid the depth of his strength. He didn't flinch at Daniel's words, only paused slightly, then looked up with a calm, unreadable expression. "I bet you've never even seen a real fight in your life, have you?" Daniel added with a sneer. Brandon's eyes lingered on Daniel, then drifted to the students, some of whom were shifting uncomfortably, uncertain if they should laugh or look away. He had only been working at the gym for a few weeks, mostly at night after everyone had cleared out. But tonight, the advanced session had run longer than usual, and Brandon had quietly gone about his job, mopping the floors, cleaning sweat from the equipment, and keeping to himself. "I'm just finishing my work," Brandon replied politely, voice calm but edged with steel. "Didn't mean to interrupt your training." Daniel threw back his head and laughed, theatrically turning to his students. "Look at this. The janitor doesn't want to spar. Maybe he's scared. Maybe he thinks a mop is a weapon." A few students chuckled. Others looked down, uneasy. Still, Brandon turned away, resuming his mop strokes. But Daniel wasn't finished. He strutted forward, closing the gap between them. "Come on. Don't be shy. I'll go easy. Just show these kids the difference between a trained fighter and a guy who sweeps up their sweat." Brandon paused. His grip on the mop tightened. Memories flickered, old memories he'd spent 20 years trying to bury. The roar of a crowd. The cold, clinical smell of liniment. A body lying still on a mat. Blood. "I'm just here to do my job," he said again, softer this time. "Please, let's not make a scene." Daniel leaned closer, his voice dropping. "You afraid, old man? Afraid you'll break a hip?" That got a few real laughs. Brandon closed his eyes for a moment, then looked down. His body was still. But inside, a storm was building. A slow, steady rage that burned not with hate, but with heartbreak. He wasn't just a janitor. Once he had been something else. A name whispered in hushed awe among MMA circles. The Silent Storm. Brandon Lewis had dominated the fighting world in his 20s. 5-time world champion. Undefeated. Cold and controlled. Never smiled. Never taunted. Never spoke in the ring. His silence was his power. But that power had destroyed everything. 20 years earlier, in Las Vegas, he had been training for his 6th title defense. His sparring partner that day had been Tony Roberts, his childhood best friend. They had grown up side by side on the south side of Chicago, scraping to survive, dreaming of becoming something more. That dream had brought them to the big leagues. But on that one afternoon, haunted by jeers from a racist crowd the week before, Brandon couldn't keep his anger buried. A light spar turned into something else, something darker. A punch too hard. A fall too fast. A neck bent wrong. Tony never got up again. Doctors said it was an accident. But Brandon knew better. It had been a loss of control. A moment of rage. And it had killed the only brother he'd ever known. So he vanished. He left the lights, the belts, the endorsements, changed his name in the records, took whatever jobs he could find, warehouses, diners, now janitorial work. Anything quiet. Anything that kept him away from the mat. Until now. Until Daniel Mitchell's sneering voice reached into his past and pulled out a ghost he thought he'd buried. Back in the gym, Daniel clapped his hands. "Let's give it up for our resident janitor, folks. The only man in here who thinks mop fu is a real martial art." The students gave a few hesitant chuckles, but many glanced toward Brandon with conflicted expressions. Brandon set the mop aside. His back was still to Daniel. For a moment he didn't move. Then slowly, deliberately he turned. "You don't want this," he said quietly. Daniel scoffed. What I don't want is a coward pretending he's something more. Brandon stared at him. That look, still unshaken, unnerved Daniel for just a second. But he shook it off. Fine. If you're too scared, keep mopping. We've all seen enough. He turned to the class, ready to laugh it off again, but then Brandon's voice cut through the room, low and firm. If I fight you and I win, you apologize. To everyone. Publicly. For your words. For your disrespect. Daniel blinked, thrown off for a moment. What? Brandon stepped forward. That's my only condition. You mock me in front of them. If I beat you, you said it right. The gym fell into silence. Daniel's pride flared red. You've got yourself a deal. He cracked his neck and stepped onto the mat, beckoning. Come on then. Let's end this. Brandon didn't flinch. He unbuttoned his janitor's jacket and let it fall to the floor. And in that moment, every student in the room stared in shock. Underneath was a body carved from years of discipline. Lean muscle, pale scars, movements far too controlled for a man who just mopped floors. Daniel saw it too. A flicker of confusion passed his eyes. And for the first time, he hesitated. But it was already too late. Because Brandon Lewis, the silent storm, had stepped back into the ring. As Brandon stepped onto the mat, the temperature in the gym seemed to drop. The air thickened with tension, every student holding their breath. Gone was the quiet janitor they'd ignored or pitied. Standing before them now was someone else. A man whose presence commanded silence without needing to raise his voice. Daniel tried to shrug off the unease creeping up his spine. Nice muscles, he said sarcastically. Hope they're not just for show. Brandon didn't respond. His silence spoke louder than words ever could. The students lined up against the mirrored wall, some whispering in disbelief, others wide-eyed and silent. Emily Chin, one of the top students in the dojo, furrowed her brow as she watched Brandon's stance. It was too practiced, too refined. She had seen this before, only in professional fighters. Ready? Daniel barked, rolling his neck, hopping side to psych himself up. Brandon simply nodded. Mr. Harris, the gym manager, sensing things were escalating fast, reluctantly stepped in to act as referee. Okay, gentlemen, keep it controlled. No injuries. Touch gloves. Brandon stepped forward, offered his open palm. Daniel slapped it with unnecessary force, trying to assert dominance. Then stepped back. The moment Mr. Harris signaled the match, Daniel surged forward like a bull, swinging a sharp left jab followed by a spinning kick aimed at Brandon's ribs. It never landed. Brandon moved like water, fluid, calm, controlled. He slipped the punch, pivoted just enough to let the kick pass by with an inch of air. His feet barely made a sound on the mat, his breathing was steady, his eyes laser-focused. Daniel growled and launched another flurry, cross elbow low kick. Brandon dodged everything. He didn't counter. He didn't taunt. He simply moved. Within 30 seconds, Daniel was visibly frustrated. His face flushed. His breathing heavier. What the hell is going on? Why can't I touch him? The students began to murmur. Whispers flared through the crowd like sparks. He's not just avoiding, he's controlling the whole fight, one said. He's not even sweating, another added. Emily's eyes widened as recognition settled in her chest. She pulled out her phone, opened her browser and typed, Brandon Lewis MMA. She didn't even need to finish typing. Dozens of articles, fight highlights and headlines exploded onto her screen. Brandon Silent Storm Lewis, the man who dismantled Titans in silence. 5-time undefeated champion disappears after tragic sparring incident. The storm that vanished, where is Brandon Lewis now? Emily gasped. Her eyes flicked to Brandon, who was still calmly evading Daniel's increasingly wild strikes. She turned to the student next to her and whispered, He's Brandon Lewis. The Brandon Lewis. The words spread like wildfire. Every face in the gym turned to Brandon with new eyes. And Daniel finally noticed. He could feel the shift, the murmurs, the awe in their eyes that was no longer for him. What are you all looking at? He snapped mid-fight, his voice cracking with frustration. Focus on the fight. But no one listened, because they were already witnessing something far more important than a gym sparring match. They were watching a ghost come back to life. Daniel, driven by his bruised pride, rushed again. A reckless kick. A sharp jab. His form was breaking down. Brandon ducked, sidestepped, then finally spoke. Daniel, he said calmly, you're not fighting me. You're fighting your ego. Daniel roared and charged. This time, Brandon slipped past him and let Daniel stumble forward, off balance. He didn't even touch him. Just used his momentum against him. Daniel skidded and nearly fell. Laughter didn't erupt, but the silence was worse. The kind of silence that meant judgment had already begun. "Come on," Daniel shouted, turning red. "Fight me." But Brandon didn't budge. "This isn't a real fight," he said. "This is a man desperate to prove he's stronger than someone who never said he wasn't." Daniel's rage peaked. He launched a full-force spinning back kick, a move meant to end the match. Brandon stepped inside the arc of the kick and swept Daniel's standing leg. The black belt crashed to the mat with a thud. Gasps filled the room. Brandon didn't follow up. He didn't gloat. He stepped back and waited. Daniel lay there panting. Sweat dripping from his face, chest rising and falling like a piston. The fight was over. And everyone knew it, except Daniel. He scrambled to his feet and yelled, "Again!" Brandon shook his head. "There's nothing more to prove." You think you're better than me?" Daniel barked, eyes wild. Brandon looked around the gym, then back at him. "No," he said quietly. "I just stopped needing to prove it a long time ago." Daniel charged again. This time Brandon didn't move. He let the first punch come, sidestepped it, and finally countered, not with a brutal blow but with a simple redirection. A gentle arm trap. A pivot. A wrist lock that spun Daniel to the ground face first. Brandon held it for just a second, just enough to show he could have snapped it if he wanted to. Then released. Daniel didn't get up this time. He just lay there, gasping, pride shattered into pieces too small to sweep up. Emily stepped forward. She couldn't stay silent any longer. She held up her phone and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "This man is Brandon Lewis." The silent storm. Undefeated 5-time MMA champion. The gym froze. Even Mr. Harris's mouth fell open. Daniel's head turned slightly toward her voice. Then toward Brandon. Realization dawned, slow and painful. You're? Brandon nodded once. "I was. But not anymore." Daniel's voice cracked. "Why? Why would you work here? As a janitor?" Brandon's expression softened. "Because I lost control. And someone I loved paid the price." A hush fell over the room. No one knew what to say. No one dared move. Brandon stepped forward and offered Daniel a hand. And after a long pause, Daniel took it. Brandon pulled him to his feet. "I didn't step onto the mat to beat you, Daniel," he said. "I stepped on it to stop you from becoming who I used to be." Daniel's eyes glossed over. His shoulders slumped. The arrogance was gone. And in its place, something far more human. Daniel stood on shaky legs, still gripping Brandon's hand, the adrenaline slowly draining from his body. His breaths were shallow. His shoulders hunched forward, not from exhaustion but from the crushing weight of humiliation. Around him, the students remained frozen in a stunned hush, their entire perception of reality rearranged in a single evening. The man they had dismissed as just a janitor had just dismantled their top instructor without throwing a single damaging blow. And now, instead of celebrating, he stood before them calm, steady, almost sorrowful. It was the behavior of someone who had seen too much, lost too much, and gained wisdom through pain. Daniel looked down at the mat. He began, voice thin and strained, "I don't know what to say." Brandon let go of his hand. "Then don't say anything yet. Just listen." Mr. Harris, still reeling from the revelation, stepped forward. "Brandon, why didn't you ever tell me? If I had known who you were." "I didn't want you to know," Brandon interrupted gently. "Because who I was isn't who I am anymore." Emily Chen, still holding her phone, stepped forward, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and conviction. "But, you're the reason I joined martial arts. I watched your fights when I was a kid. I memorized your footwork. You were untouchable." Brandon looked at her, his gaze softening. That version of me was powerful. But he was also reckless. He didn't know how to stop the storm once it started. He paused. "I didn't just walk away from fighting. I walked away because I killed my best friend with a punch I couldn't take back." Gasps rippled through the gym. Brandon continued, eyes unfocused, speaking to a room but seeing only one face, Tony's. His name was Tony Roberts. We were like brothers. We trained together. Laughed together. Grew up dodging gangs and hunger in Chicago. He was the only family I had. And I let my anger take him from me. Daniel's mouth parted, stunned. That was you?" Brandon nodded. "I vanished after that. Couldn't bear to be in the same circles. Took odd jobs. Stayed under the radar. I came here just to clean, to stay away from everything that reminded me of who I used to be." The students stood silent, their eyes no longer curious but reverent. "You don't understand what it feels like to be cheered by millions," Then haunted by one silence, Brandon whispered. Tony never said a word as he fell. And I've spent 20 years trying to fill that silence with something good. Daniel's jaw trembled. Mr. Harris finally spoke quietly. You've already done that tonight, Brandon? Brandon turned to Daniel. You still owe them something. Daniel blinked, realizing. The deal. The promise. He stepped forward. Every step felt heavier than the last. He turned to the crowd of students. His students, whose respect had once bolstered his ego but now stared at him with measured, expectant silence. He swallowed hard. He began, voice cracking. I mocked a man I didn't know. I used my position and pride to humiliate someone who had more strength and dignity in one quiet moment than I've shown in years. He took a breath, forcing his voice to stay steady. I want to apologize to all of you. For the disrespect, the arrogance, for treating martial arts as a ladder instead of a path. I let my belt define me. But Brandon showed me that true mastery isn't about dominance. It's about control, humility, and knowing when to stop. He turned to Brandon, head bowed. I'm sorry. I truly am. Brandon didn't speak for a moment. Then he nodded. That's a start. The students erupted, not in applause but in a collective exhale. As if the tension had finally broken. They looked at Brandon with something deeper than admiration. Respect. Not for his past titles. But for his humility, his pain, and his willingness to stand in it without shame. Emily wiped a tear from her cheek. The youngest student in the room, a boy no older than 12, raised his hand shyly. Mr. Brandon? Will you teach us? The room went still again. Brandon blinked. Mr. Harris turned, almost pleading. We could use someone like you. Not just to teach techniques, but to teach what really matters. For the first time in a very long time, Brandon hesitated. Not out of fear, but from a realization. This could be his second chance. Not to return to fame, but to rebuild his purpose. He looked at the faces around him, wide-eyed, hopeful, honest. And he gave a single nod. I'll teach, he said. If you're willing to learn not just how to fight, but how to live. The room erupted in applause. Genuine, thunderous applause. Even Daniel clapped, tears threatening to spill. That night, something profound shifted in the heart of elite martial arts. The students didn't leave talking about who won the spar. They left talking about what it meant to be strong. The next morning the gym felt different. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting soft golden lines across the polished floor. For the first time, Brandon arrived not with a mop in hand, but with a quiet confidence resting on his shoulders. He wore a simple black gi, unadorned, without rank or ego, and stood barefoot at the front of the room facing nearly 36 students. Every single one of them had shown up early. Word had spread like wildfire. Not just about the sparring match that left Daniel Mitchell flat on his back, but about who Brandon truly was. The silent storm had returned. But not as a fighter. As a teacher. Brandon stood silently for a moment, letting the students settle. No music. No speeches. Just silence and breath. Then he bowed. Before we begin, he said, I need to be clear about something. If you came here to learn how to fight and hurt people, you're in the wrong place. If you came here to learn how not to fight, then welcome. A few students chuckled nervously. He paced slowly along the front, his voice calm and even. Martial arts isn't about showing off. It's not about power. It's not about breaking bricks or looking tough in a mirror. He paused. It's about control. And the hardest person you'll ever have to control is yourself. Daniel Mitchell stood quietly near the doorway, not dressed in his usual black gi. Just a simple t-shirt and jeans. He didn't speak. Didn't approach the mat. But he stayed the entire time, watching every word and movement. Brandon noticed. And didn't turn him away. The lesson began with slow breathing. Then footwork. Not strikes, not sparring, just movement. Flow. Before you throw a punch, Brandon said, you must know why you're throwing it. And what price you're willing to pay for it. Emily Chin, who had trained under Daniel for nearly 3 years, felt like she was seeing martial arts with fresh eyes. She followed every motion Brandon made, studied the space between his steps, the pause between his breaths. He wasn't fast. He wasn't flashy. But every movement had intention. By the end of the session, no one wanted to leave. Later that day, Brandon sat alone in the back office with Mr. Harris. A fresh contract lay on the desk in front of him. Harris looked almost sheepish. I can't offer you the salary you probably made when you were in Vegas, he said. But I can offer you the freedom to run this gym your way. Brandon looked at the paper, then out the window where he could see students still practicing the drills he just taught. "I'm not here for money," he replied. "I'm here to keep a promise." "To Tony?" Harris asked softly. Brandon nodded. "He always said we'd open a school together one day. Teach kids from places like ours. He didn't make it. But maybe, this is how I bring that promise back." He signed the paper. The silent storm was officially back. But this time it wasn't about glory. It was about healing. Over the next few weeks, Brandon's classes exploded in popularity. Parents brought their children not just to learn how to block or kick, but to understand the values Brandon preached: humility, discipline, compassion. He spent as much time off the mat as he did on it, helping students with personal problems, offering advice, or simply listening. Each story he shared, about loss, about control, about choosing peace over violence, became its own kind of lesson. And Daniel? He came every day. At first just to watch. Then to clean the mats after class. Then one day he stepped onto the floor again, this time without the black belt. He wore white just like a beginner. He bowed low to Brandon and said, "If you'll have me, I'd like to start over." Brandon smiled. "Then let's begin." No one cheered. No one clapped. But everyone watching understood the magnitude of what was happening. Redemption wasn't a moment, it was a choice made again and again. One afternoon, as the students wrapped up drills, Emily approached Brandon. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. He nodded. "That night, when you fought Daniel, why didn't you hit him?" Brandon looked at her, then gently sat down on the mat. "Because I wasn't fighting him," he said. "I was fighting the version of me that took Tony's life. And I needed to prove to myself that I could win, without losing control." Emily blinked, her throat tightening. Brandon continued, "Anyone can throw a punch. But not everyone can walk away from one. That's where real strength lives." Emily didn't reply. She just bowed. And in that bow was a respect deeper than any belt could represent. Brandon's words echoed in Emily's mind long after she left the gym that day. That's where real strength lives. It wasn't the kind of thing she'd ever heard from Daniel. Before Brandon arrived, strength had always meant winning, dominating, rising through the ranks. But now, strength meant something quieter. Something harder. Something rooted in restraint. By the end of the month, Brandon's classes had nearly tripled in size. Children who once shied away from sparring now volunteered. Adults returned to martial arts after years away, drawn by the new energy pulsing through the dojo, not adrenaline but purpose. One morning, a mother approached Brandon in the hallway. Her son, Jamal, had struggled with anger issues and had been suspended from school multiple times for fighting. But since training under Brandon, something had changed. "He used to come home angry like a storm," she said, voice cracking. "Now, he comes home quiet. Not silent in a bad way. Calm. Thoughtful." Brandon placed a hand on her shoulder. "Storms can be powerful. But the best storms are the ones that pass without destruction." Meanwhile, Daniel continued his journey of humility. He trained alongside the beginners. He bowed to teenagers who were half his size. He took correction without resistance, without defensiveness. At first, some students didn't know how to act around him. After all, this was the man who once strutted across the mats, barking commands and flaunting his superiority. But slowly something changed. Daniel listened more than he spoke. He smiled but didn't perform. When he made mistakes, he didn't deflect, he learned. One evening, as Brandon watched from the edge of the mat, he saw Daniel patiently teaching a young girl how to fall properly without hurting herself. Not showing off. Not trying to win her admiration. Just helping. Mr. Harris walked up beside Brandon and whispered, "I almost don't recognize him." Brandon smiled faintly. "That's the point of all this, isn't it?" 2 months in, a special visitor arrived at the gym. It was a journalist from a local paper, following a viral online thread about the silent storm who returned as a janitor. Brandon had gone from obscure legend to whispered inspiration, and now, people wanted the full story. "Why now?" the journalist asked him during their interview. Brandon took a long breath. "Because hiding didn't fix anything. I thought if I disappeared, the guilt would disappear too. But it doesn't work like that. You can't outrun your past. You can only make peace with it." He paused, then added, "And sometimes, peace means stepping back into the ring, not to fight someone else but to face yourself." The article ran 2 days later under the title, "From Champion to Janitor to Teacher, the Silent Storm Finds His Voice." It spread faster than anyone expected. Not because it was about a fighter, but because it was about a man who had fallen, broken, and stood back up. Soon after, Brandon was invited to speak at a city youth center. He almost said no. Speaking in front of crowds still made him uncomfortable. But when he saw who the event was for, young boys from low-income neighborhoods just like the one he grew up in, he couldn't turn away. Standing before the crowd in a simple t-shirt and jeans, Brandon told them the truth. I had everything once. Fame, money, trophies. But none of it meant anything when I lost my best friend because I couldn't control my anger. The room fell silent. Real power, he said slowly, is knowing you can hit, and choosing not to. It's walking away even when every part of you wants to explode. When the session ended, dozens of kids lined up to shake his hand. One boy, barely 10, looked up at him with wide eyes. Do you think someone like me could become strong like you? Brandon knelt so they were eye level. You already are, he said. Because you're asking the right question. Back at the gym, Brandon noticed something unexpected. Daniel had started arriving earlier than everyone else. Cleaning the mats. Setting up gear. He did it without being asked. One morning, Brandon caught him carefully folding GIs and lining them up on the shelves. You don't have to do that, Brandon said. Daniel straightened up. I know, he replied. But I never realized how much I took for granted. How much I expected others to do for me. He paused, then looked Brandon in the eye. I spent years thinking a black belt gave me the right to be respected. But now I know, respect is something you earn every day. Brandon didn't say anything at first. Then he nodded. You've learned the hardest lesson. That makes you a better martial artist than most I've ever trained with. Daniel looked away, swallowing emotion. By the third month, Brandon's class had grown so large that Mr. Harris began discussing opening a second dojo under Brandon's name. At first, Brandon hesitated. The idea of putting his name back into the spotlight unnerved him. But one night, as he sat in the empty gym after class, he thought about Tony. They had dreamed of opening a gym together. A place that wasn't just about winning, but about changing lives. Maybe now was the time to fulfill that promise. He walked over to the large whiteboard by the entrance. With a marker, he scrawled 2 words in big, bold letters. Silent Storm Dojo, coming soon. The students noticed it the next day and erupted with joy. But Brandon simply smiled and said, this time we fight for something bigger. The grand opening of the Silent Storm Dojo was unlike anything the city had seen. The walls weren't lined with trophies or championship belts. There were no glossy posters of knockouts or brutal victories. Instead, the entryway displayed framed photos of students helping each other, handwritten quotes about self-control and resilience, and a memorial corner, just one small shelf with a pair of old gloves and a picture of Tony Roberts. Beneath it was a plaque. The storm within is the one we must learn to master. Brandon stood near the entrance, greeting every guest with a calm nod and warm eyes. Parents brought their children. Former students traveled across state lines to shake his hand. Some MMA veterans even showed up, not to challenge but to pay their respects. But no one's presence struck more than Daniel Mitchell's. He arrived in a plain GI, no belt. He stood at the door for a long moment as if uncertain whether he should enter. Brandon saw him and walked over. You showed up, Brandon said. Daniel nodded. I almost didn't. Why? Daniel looked around the space, his voice low. Because this place, it feels like what I always wanted to build. I just went about it all wrong. Brandon placed a hand on his shoulder. You're not late. You're just in time. Daniel's eyes filled, but he blinked the tears away and stepped inside. He wasn't the man who once barked orders. He was a student again. A man reshaping himself from the inside out. In the following months, Silent Storm Dojo became more than a gym. It became a sanctuary. Brandon's classes were packed, not just because of his legendary past, but because of the atmosphere he cultivated. Students were encouraged to reflect, to write journals about their emotional triggers, to speak up if they felt overwhelmed. Discipline was taught, but so was empathy. Daniel began teaching a beginner's class on Saturday mornings, his students unaware of his past unless they asked. He never spoke of it unless it could help them avoid his mistakes. One day after class, a young boy named Marcus lingered behind. He was 13, withdrawn, with anger issues that had nearly gotten him expelled from school. He looked at Brandon, then asked quietly, "Did you ever hate yourself for messing up?" Brandon crouched beside him. "Every day for 20 years. Marcus's eyes widened. "But then I realized," Brandon continued, "you don't stop hating yourself by running away. You stop by doing better. By making sure your pain helps someone else avoid their own." Marcus didn't speak. He just nodded slowly. And Brandon knew the boy had just taken his first real step toward strength. A year passed. Brandon was invited to speak at national martial arts conferences. Not to demonstrate flashy techniques, but to talk about mental discipline, emotional intelligence, and healing. His story had become something of a legend, not because of his titles, but because of the man he chose to become after losing it all. In one speech he said, "People think martial arts is about power. But real power is knowing you can break someone, and choosing to help them rise instead." That quote found its way onto posters and dojos around the country. But Brandon never let the attention distract him. He spent every morning opening the doors of his dojo, sweeping the floors himself before class began. He insisted it helped him stay grounded. When asked why he didn't let someone else do it, he smiled and said, "Because I never want to forget who I was when I started over." One late afternoon, long after classes had ended, Brandon stood alone in the dojo, looking at the photo of Tony. "I hope you'd be proud," he whispered. The door opened behind him. It was Daniel. He walked over and stood beside him, staring at the same photo. "I think he would be," Daniel said softly. "And I think he'd be proud of both of us." Brandon nodded. They stood there in silence for a long moment, two men shaped by pain, once broken by pride, now united by something stronger, understanding. The camera pans out from the photo of Tony to show a dojo full of life. Kids practicing basic stances, teens journaling on the bench, parents watching with pride, and instructors guiding with patience. The legacy of the silent storm wasn't in his undefeated record. It was in every soul he helped reshape, every heart he helped calm, every storm he helped silence. Brandon Lewis's story reminds us that real strength isn't about proving yourself to others. It's about conquering yourself. Humility, respect, and the courage to change are the greatest victories of all. As Brandon said, "The fiercest storm is the one inside, and when you master it, the world can no longer shake you." If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment with your favorite moment or lesson from Brandon's journey. And don't forget to subscribe to True Echo for more powerful, emotional stories that remind us all of what really matters. See you next time.